Released in 2020 for the Nintendo Entertainment System, courtesy of the 6502 Collective and developed by Gradual Games. Trophy is a side-scrolling action platformer where you control Trophy, a robotic being who is actually the amalgamation of man and machine who must venture through 9 evil empires to foil the evil machinations of Lord Q. Sounds good to me. Upon starting the game, you're given a choice of 8 stages to choose from, and you can tackle these stages in any order you wish. And each stage pretty much plays out more or less the same way. Go through the stage, kill enemies, collect power-ups, look for alternate paths that may contain hidden upgrades such as heart containers and weapon boosts, and eventually reach and defeat the big bad boss of each level. The big bosses being one of the selling points of this NES homebrew game. Once all 8 stages are cleared, it's off to the final level where the nefarious Lord Q awaits. At first glance, Trophy's gameplay bears a somewhat striking resemblance to that one game there, and it's understandable to make that comparison. You have a stage select, you have a main blaster that only shoots left or right, but your shots can pass through solid matter. You jump high underwater and in deep space, you can't crouch, you can't slide, and to give it a bit more of that throwback Mega feel, spikes will kill you instantly regardless of invincibility frames. So it's something of a bare bones Mega clone. So bare bones that clearing a stage or beating a boss nets you no reward whatsoever. You get a thumbs up on the stage select screen, and that's it. Even so, Trophy isn't totally without boosts in performance. There are life-extending heart containers hidden within the main stages, but you can also uncover a couple blaster upgrades, which merely increases the size of your shots and not necessarily the damage output. These enhancements are also tied to your health, meaning if you're low on health, you're stuck with your default shot until you eventually heal up and restore your strength. Your most powerful upgrade, the wide shot, can only be used at full health, so while Trophy has upgrades, they are not without drawbacks. So it's safe to say that there's more than enough similarities between Trophy and the Blue Bomber that will invite the inevitable comparisons, and to be honest, that's a bit of a detriment to Trophy. Because while the gameplay is similar, it's also the bare minimum. Clearing stages won't net you any new weapons or abilities, the weapon enhancements you'll seek out aren't anything special, and even then their uses are entirely conditional. And while each stage has a big giant boss for you to contend with, which warrants being a selling point on the back of the box so to speak, each of the bosses have fairly simplistic patterns that, once you figure it out, will seem somewhat trivial. Which is probably why they offset that by having these things take so many goddamn fucking hits that it becomes a matter of how long you're able to keep up this holding pattern until one of you eventually bites the dust. And this is where the comparison to Mega Man starts to bite Trophy in the ass, because the lack of offensive options in dealing with these bosses become readily apparent, especially if what the game gives you as weapon enhancements feel not only limiting but also woefully inefficient. Even compared to other Mega clones such as the Korean Conquest or Totally Rad, Trophy feels somewhat bare bones in its feature set. That having been said, Trophy is a perfectly fine little action platformer, and with little it does fairly well. Controls are pretty solid, functional, responsive. Trophy handles really well, jumping has a bit of a float but is otherwise pretty slick. The level design is fairly solid for the most part, not so much relying on gimmickry but rather just plain old run and jump platforming, with the occasional tricky enemy placement, and some drops of faith in the vertical segments that might have you colliding with an enemy below, which is lame. Also, Trophy has a bit of a questionable hitbox, which mostly comes into play with certain spikes, as well as the unfortunate traditional knockback that proves even more unfortunate with seemingly cheap traps in regards to questionable enemy placement. Naturally, if your health is depleted, you fall into a pit or a bed of spikes, you lose a life. But Trophy is somewhat generous with its checkpoints. Even losing at a boss fight, you just respawn at the boss fight. Once you lose all your lives, it's game over and back to the stage select screen. At 9 stages, Trophy is a typically short game, and with some practice, you could probably beat this game within an hour at most. Regardless, there's a fairly simple password system that will keep track of your progress should you need it. Speaking of passwords, as I was digging a little deeper in the game, I came across some additional content, which includes a password that grants you all of the game's obtainable upgrades, as well as a few more that are not quite obtainable in-game, such as further health extensions, as well as an additional ability to produce temporary platforms for Trophy to stand on and assist in reaching higher platforms. I don't know why this would be cut. Maybe they never got around to implementing it properly, or maybe it was because of stuff like this. Oops. I don't know. Maybe someday they'll address that. But yeah, that's kind of unfortunate. But still, that's something if you want to play around with more of what Trophy has to offer, which again isn't a whole lot, but it's something, I suppose. Trophy sports some pretty decent looking 8-bit graphics on the NES. The cutscenes are well drawn, the sprite work is pretty solid, even though I find it a bit odd that some enemies would share the same color palette as Trophy, so if he changes colors, so do they. That's kind of odd, but otherwise pretty nice. The backgrounds and level layouts are pretty detailed and somewhat colorful. Well, okay, the carnival level looks like something pulled from one of those old MS-DOS games running with CGA graphics. And some stages share some striking inspiration from other levels of that other franchise, if you will. But the rest of the game looks fine. The big bosses that Trophy touts as a selling point are well drawn, though don't expect any huge leaps in this regard. Big enemy bosses on the NES often have technical limitations in what they can actually do, and this game is no exception to that rule. Speaking of technical limitations, Trophy will occasionally show bouts of slowdown when there's too much going on screen, but in general performs well enough and is a generally fine-looking unlicensed Nintendo game. Trophy also has some decent sound to its credit. Again, nothing taxing for the hardware, but more than serviceable sound effects complement Trophy's rather catchy soundtrack. There's some good tunes to be found in this here homebrew, and I found myself bopping to some of the varied beats in this game. Again, the carnival level has probably the weakest track in my opinion, but even that one is somewhat okay-ish at worst. Overall, Trophy is a perfectly acceptable action platform game. Nothing that's going to stand out or blow your socks out, but for those who want some fairly basic and traditional platforming fare on the old NES, Trophy delivers that rather adequately with a solid game that's fun to play, and that's all I could ever ask for. All in all, a fine homebrew on the NES, so long as you keep your expectations in check.